What I'm going to do now is just introduce our theme for the week, the particular limb of the Eightfold Path, which is perfect effort. So just to kind of start by reminding us of the image of the Eightfold Path, which is the wheel, the Dhamma Chakra, as it's called, the wheel of the Dharma, with its 8 spokes, which represent the 8 limbs or the 8 aspects of the path. And as we've seen, the path is separated into the path of vision and the path of transformation. So initially, the vision arises, which is like a glimpse or a glimpse of the way things really are. And that in a way can be quite a disruptive experience. It's worth saying. It can disrupt the normal patterns of our life, because we may realize, for example, that actually we're not satisfied with the way things are. And we also realize that we don't have to accept the way things are. I think often we just don't know any different. We just think, well, this is the way that we have to be. This is the sort of preordained pattern for a human being. So we were just talking about that in our group, just in terms of work. This whole kind of notion of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That whole kind of way of thinking about what work is something that we just kind of inherit. And I think part of what the last week's exploration was about is just actually questioning that. I mean, we may decide that that's the way we want to work, that's the way we want to live, but we might decide actually we could do something different. So I think that's what, if you've read the chapter in the book, I think that's what the question is that's being raised. I mean, we may or may not be able to work for 6 months and take 6 months off, but the point is just to actually ask the question. I mean, would that be possible, and would that be desirable? So the path of vision represents that glimpse of a different way of being, of a different way of seeing even. And then the path of transformation involves the transformation of the whole of our life in accordance with that vision, or trying to bring that glimpse more and more into actual life, into actual being. So first of all, transforming our emotional life. So actually transforming our basic emotional attitudes and cultivating things like metta, love and kindness, generosity, renunciation, letting go of things which hold us back, faith and confidence and trust and so on, all those kinds of things. And then there's speech, perfect speech, which means recognizing that if we're going to really transform, we need to transform the way that we communicate. Communication being so much part of what human beings are involved in, what human beings do. And then we looked at perfect action, which is in a way bringing those principles into the principles of truth and goodness, you could say, even into our actual behavior, what we do and what we say in our everyday life. And then in last week, we looked particularly at the area of work. And what this represented was the transformation, not just of the individual, but this stage represents the transformation of the collective, the transformation of society. It highlights the fact that the Buddha's path, the Buddha's teaching, is concerned with not just the transformation of individuals, but the transformation of the collective. So that the whole environment is more conducive to the development of the individual, recognizing that we can't exist completely separate from our environment. Our environment affects us as in the same way that we affect our environment. So that was just by way of a brief recap. So this week we find ourselves looking at perfect effort, which is the 6th limb of the path, and what this is really highlighting, I think, that the fact that this is one of the 8. Last week we saw that work was highlighted, and what this highlights, the 6th limb is in a way quite a general thing. It's highlighting the fact that the Dharma life, the Buddhist life, is an active life. It's dynamic, it's vigorous, it's even heroic. So it's not necessarily something that's physically active, but it involves mental activity, intellectual activity, even emotional activity, you could say, aesthetic activity. It's not kind of an armchair life. So the Buddhist life is a life for people who are prepared to kind of have a go at something, to really try to make an effort. So it's true, I think, that anything that's really genuinely worth striving for, that anything that's genuinely good, that's genuinely beneficial or genuinely beautiful, in order to bring that into being, it will require effort, maybe even quite considerable effort. I've just been reading a book recently about an artist, a British artist called Derek Jarman. Some of you might have heard of him. He was particularly known for his films, but he also made visual art. And what's really striking when you read about his life is just how incredibly active he was. He was just constantly producing and constantly exploring different symbols and different images and different ways of expressing the kind of inner world of human beings through these films and paintings and poems that he made. And actually, interestingly, he was just describing one passage. He contracted AIDS in the 80s and was very, very unwell, but kept working. It's one of the really striking things about his life. He kept working even though he was extremely unwell. And he talks about right at the end of his life in the early 90s, he's making paintings, huge paintings with lots and lots of paint, really thick paint. And he describes it as being like being a child in a sandpit, just that kind of sense of enjoyment and play and fun. So I think that's I just wanted to bring that in because I think it's not just in the kind of, as it were, spiritual realm that this pertains, but also in the aesthetic or the cultural or the artistic realm, where effort is required to bring something to being. I mean, it goes for any kind of realm of human activity. To really do something worthwhile, it does require effort, and this is included in the Buddhist path. And it maybe is a slightly different idea about Buddhism than what we might have encountered. I think often Buddhism has got a very kind of soft kind of image that Buddhism's all about, like being kind to yourself and being very open and being very calm and very peaceful. And it is those things, but it's not those things as opposed to being active. In a way, what Buddhism offers is an integration of the calm and the more peaceful aspect of things that is also integrated with activity. So I think actually the two don't necessarily need to be in conflict. Often for us, it feels like we can either be really active and really busy, or we can be calm. But the Buddhist path involves a kind of an integration of those two sides of human activity or human experience, the active side and the more receptive side. So the word that's translated as effort is vyayama. And interestingly, in modern Indian languages in northern India, it means gymnastics. So it means like actually, physical exercise in the quite literal sense. And I think part of what this is pointing to is the need to kind of stay on the ball. And I mean, I notice myself at the moment, there's quite a strong I have to kind of work against a certain kind of inertia. I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but just the way things are at the moment, it kind of feels like just an effort to kind of keep things moving, to keep on top of things, and to kind of, I don't know, keep engaged with life, as it were. And it's really striking how I was just saying earlier when I was having dinner, like, I can't believe it's Tuesday again. It just feels like Tuesday was just yesterday. So that's the thing, is that life is actually slipping away, and if we don't really grab hold of the opportunity, it'll just pass us by. So that's another sort of aspect of this part of this stage of the path, is actually really making the most of the opportunities that we have and not letting the opportunities slip by. So hopefully you kind of got a bit of a sense of what this is all about, what perfect effort is about. It's not, maybe I'll just say, it's not, perfect effort in Buddhism is not something coarse or something kind of bloody-minded or a kind of bludgeoning kind of effort. It requires subtlety and intelligence, and hopefully we'll see that. as we go through it. You could say that in terms of perfect effort, there's a general perfect effort and a specific perfect effort. So the general aspect of perfect effort is, in order to engage with any of the path of transformation, even the path of vision, we do have to apply a bit of effort. It's not just going to happen. In order to create the conditions for that transformation to happen, we do actually need to actively engage with the practice. This is probably kind of obvious, but I think it's worth pointing out. And then there's a more specific perfect effort, which is what I'm going to be talking about for the next 20 minutes or so, and following the sort of general Buddhist tradition of looking at this area. So I'm just going to share a screen here. So yeah, when you talk about and traditionally in presentations of perfect effort, you talk about it as having 4 different aspects. So there's the effort of preventing, the effort of eradicating, the effort of developing, and the effort of maintaining. So I'm going to talk about each one in turn. And what we're preventing, eradicating, developing, and maintaining are mental states. So if you remember, in a way, we've kept returning to this theme over the course of the course, and that is that Buddhism is particularly concerned with mental states, recognizing that it's really the mind that is the root of everything that happens, everything that we do in our lives is rooted in, derives from, or arises from the mind. So really what we're doing with perfect effort is getting right down to brass tacks and looking at the mind. So we're preventing unarisen, unskillful mental states. And actually, hang on, let me just skip through my slides a bit here. Preventing unarisen, skillful mental states, eradicating arisen, unskillful mental states, developing unarisen, skillful mental states, and maintaining arisen, skillful mental states. So I know there's a lot of words there, but yeah, we heard a couple of weeks ago about this distinction between skillful and unskillful. In fact, in a way, that's been right there from perfect emotion, looking at how what we're trying to do is cultivate generosity, love, understanding, and move away from selfishness, from cruelty, and from delusion. So we're moving from unskillful mental states to skillful mental states. So preventing unarisen, skillful mental states. How that's talked about in the tradition is guarding the gates to the senses. So this is where there's what we begin to notice when we start becoming aware of our mind is that we have the potential to get into unskillful mental states. It's like sometimes this expression of latent tendencies is used. We have a latent tendency to get into unskillful mental states. So if certain conditions pertain at a particular time, we're more likely to get into an unskillful mental state. It's as if it's sort of lying in wait just to be sort of woken up. So what we're doing when we guard the gates of the senses is recognizing that usually the immediate cause of an unskillful mental state is something that comes to us through our senses. That's usually the sort of oopsie daisy, sorry. That's usually what provokes an unskillful mental state. So, by the way, can you see my notes there on your screen? You can. Oh, okay. I'm just gonna stop the share there. Guarding the gates of the senses. So in the Buddhist way of looking at things, there are 6 senses. There's the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and also the mind. So the mind is considered to be a sense. So you particularly notice this with the eye. When you you notice that when you see something, it stimulates a particular mental state. So the most common one is craving. So you see something and then you want to sort of pursue it. Where I notice this most kind of clearly is through basically my computer and my phone. So often things pop up on your phone and they're actually designed to draw you in. I mean, they talk about clickbait, don't they? That people post something on their website it's intended to make you click on it so that you follow down that kind of rabbit hole of exploration. So guarding the gates to the senses is in a way not exposing yourself to things that are going to provoke that response of craving. It's really quite difficult, I think, in the modern era because so much of what we're exposed to is specifically designed to stimulate that craving. Advertising and so on. It's specifically designed to sort of trigger that response. So I think for a lot of us, guarding the gates to the senses actually, well, I mean, one of the things that I've found really helpful just on a practical level is just turning off notifications. So if you join a new social media site, they're always trying to send you lots of stuff. Like my sister's got a 3-year-old son and she invited me to join this thing where you can look at what he's doing at Play Center. And of course, I get a whole bunch of emails telling me what he's up to, which is intended to kind of make me kind of go onto the website. So anyway, I just switched them all off. So that, and part of what that is, I think, is actually making sure that if I want to look at them, kind of doing that in a conscious way, rather than just being kind of sucked into it kind of unconsciously. So I think that's a lot of what this guarding the gates to the senses is about, is not just being sucked into something, but actually being a bit more judicious about what we give our attention to. And it does involve changing our environment maybe, or just in a way not looking at certain things. Another thing you can do, which a friend of mine introduced me to recently, is you can, if you're somebody who's like really addicted to looking at stuff on your phone, you can actually make your phone screen go into grayscale. So it's just black and white and shades of grey. And it's much less kind of appealing to sort of just flick and look at things if you find that consistently kind of distracting and drawing you down into a rabbit hole. So that's hopefully kind of get the sense of what guarding the gates to the senses means. The kind of metaphor of it is that you are like a kind of like almost like a castle, and you put a guard at the entry points to the castle, which are the senses. Particularly talking about the eye sense, because that's one of the most vivid to us as human beings. What we see is so vivid to us. The other senses are maybe less vivid, except perhaps for the sense of sound. As I said, the mind is also a sense, and it's much more difficult to guard the mind because things just bubble up into the mind, don't they? You notice that when you learn to meditate, is that things just come into your mind, unbidden, as it were, so part of guarding the gates to the senses is noticing what's arising in your mind, and being just a bit judicious about what you give your attention to. So usually we just unconsciously give our attention to things, but actually that this element of guarding the gates to the senses just means being more conscious about what we're attending to in terms of what arises in our mind, and not giving our attention to those mental objects which will lead us into an unskillful mental state. So hopefully that's all clear. So that's the first one of the fourfold right efforts or perfect efforts, which is preventing unarisen, unskillful mental states. And then we do that by guarding the gates to the senses. So then we move on to the second one, which is eradicating arisen, unskillful mental state. So what's happened here is we're in an unskillful mental state. So we become aware of the fact that we're actually inhabiting or doing or embodying an unskillful mental state. And in a way, we really need to know what to do with that. and we can do quite a bit, in a way that Buddhism is quite sort of pragmatic about this. It's a bit like, okay, so you're in an unskillful mental state. Don't panic. There's something you can do. It's quite natural in a way to be in an unskillful mental state. Now, the language of eradicating is used. It sounds a bit drastic, I think. It sounds almost a little bit forceful. And in a way, I think, again, one needs to be intelligent. But I think what the language of eradicating signifies is that unskillful mental states are harmful. They're not going to do anybody any good. So for that reason, they need to be eradicated. In the same way that, when one talks about eradicating something, one often talks in terms of like pests, like cockroaches or rats or something, which are harmful. So in a sense, what's being recognized here is that unskillful mental states are harmful. It's not about, and this is where we need to be a bit careful, I think. It's not about giving a language to our own self-condemnation. I think this is often where we get a bit tripped up, is that if we've already got an impulse or a tendency to self-condemnation or self-hatred even, that we can sort of hijack this approach, and we start just feeling bad about the fact that we're in an unskillful mental state. So it's really worth remembering that in a way it's quite natural. If somebody does something that you don't like, it's natural for hatred to arise. The problem is that it's just not helpful. I was thinking it's a little bit like, when dogs are wounded, they often lick their wound, and the licking of the wound actually doesn't help the wound to heal, which is why dogs have those kind of cones on their heads. And I think that's a little bit like us sometimes. It's a bit like we're wounded, and then we lick at the wound. It's a natural thing to do, but it just doesn't help the wound to heal. We can actually exacerbate the problem. So this is where the awareness comes in. So what we're trying to do is cultivate an awareness of what state we're in, and actually just eradicate that particular mental state. But we can think about this actually as a process of protecting our happiness. So what we're trying to do when we do this is protect our happiness. It's not about aversion to self or something like that. So generally, when this stage of the perfect effort is talked about as overcoming the 5 hindrances, as they're called. Interestingly, the word for hindrances is nivarana, which means something like covering. So it's as if the hindrances, these unskillful mental states, obscure, they cover over, they stop us from seeing things clearly. So we know that, I think, as the kind of expression goes, anger makes you stupid. Often if we're in one of these states, we're just not very clear. We don't see what's going on very, very clearly. So I'm just going to run over the 5 mental states, the 5 hindrances. Just get me a screen share back. So the 5 hindrances, yeah. So here they are. So some of you will be familiar with these, but I really think it's worth going over them again, because if we can spot them, it's just really, really powerful in terms of transforming our mind. And they're probably all states of mind that we're familiar with. They're the kinds of things that plague us as human beings. So what we're trying to do is get a handle on what's actually going on. That's the purpose of doing this. It's not about giving ourselves sort of 5 new sticks to beat ourselves up with, but really understanding, okay, what is this? What is going on here? So the first one is craving for material things, or craving for sense experience, as it's sometimes called. And actually, we were just talking about this in our group earlier, that what this involves is a sense that you're not quite happy with what's happening. Your mind is kind of projecting forward to some kind of future event or some kind of future experience which you're looking forward to. And it stops you being fully present. So all of these hindrances, they hinder you being fully present, being fully absorbed in what you're doing. So your mind is kind of casting forward, usually forward with craving. So you're thinking about something that you'd rather be doing. So you're anticipating it getting sunnier. You're anticipating, your coffee and your bun, and you're anticipating, some website that you like to look at. You're some sort of food that you'd like to eat. You're anticipating just being able to sort of blob out and go to bed or watch Netflix. So you're projecting forward to some kind of experience that you'd like to have that you're not currently having. And there's actually a tension in it because you're not having that experience. There's a tension in it which is actually quite unsatisfying. So it sounds like that might be a pleasant thing to do, but it actually is unpleasant. So that's the first hindrance. The second one is ill will, and usually this involves something that's happened in the past, not always, but somebody has said something or done something which you feel injured by. There's a sense of grievance, and you can't quite let it go. It's often accompanied by anger, a sense of injustice maybe, and you keep kind of reliving it. It's you keep producing that thought in your mind, and a kind of a clenching that happens with it. So as we'll see a bit later on this evening, these states, they're not just, we call them mental states, but really it's a state of being which has a mental element, but it also has an emotional element, and it also has a physical element. And you notice that with ill will, that there's thoughts flowing through your mind of grievance, of annoyance, of criticism. Emotionally, it's kind of hot and unpleasant, and physically, your whole being kind of contracts and clenches. So that's ill will, and there's a whole species of other kind of associated mental states, but that's the basic one. So that's the second hindrance. The third hindrance is restlessness and anxiety. Flurry and worry is what it's often called. So this is sort of an inability to sort of settle. You're always worried about something. And it's interesting, I've just been reading a book about a writer a British writer called Christopher Isherwood, who was living in America just at the time of the beginning, or the bit I'm reading about is just at the beginning of the Second World War. And he's just describing this intense atmosphere of anxiety. Nobody knows quite what's going to happen. They don't know quite what's going to happen in terms of what the Nazis are going to do next. He doesn't know if Britain's going to be invaded. He thinks that if it is, it's probably going to be overrun, etc. But he's sort of talking about this kind of atmosphere and how that's permeating his mind as well. And I do think we're quite susceptible, we're quite sensitive to environments around us, and there can be a kind of an atmosphere of anxiety. And I mean, certainly in the last year or so, there's been an awful lot of this, I think, and we are sort of susceptible to that. We do pick up on it. So that's just sort of briefly restlessness and anxiety. This sort of the mind that's sort of whipped up into a bit of a frenzy, and a body that can't stay still. We're kind of restless physically as well. The next one is sloth and torpor, which is a kind of a dullness. It's quite a deep resistance to just facing up to the reality of what's happening. And it's interesting, I was saying in my group earlier, I've been experiencing a bit of this recently. Just part of me just doesn't want to engage. I just want to kind of hibernate. So sometimes finding myself in quite a kind of a dull mental state, and sort of a heaviness in the body, quite sort of difficult to work with. But that's sloth and torpor. I mean, typically you notice this when you're meditating, because your head nods. Your system kind of shuts down. So that's the fourth one of these, and the fifth one is doubt, doubt and indecision. So that's where you just can't quite make up your mind about what it is that you want to do. It's really quite debilitating, actually, because you can't decide whether to do this thing or whether to do that thing. So where I notice this sometimes is like I've got a long list of tasks to do. I've got like today I had no meetings. Unusually, I had no meetings all day. I had a list of tasks. Now, if I'm not careful, I don't make a clear decision about which one I'm going to do next. So I kind of do a little bit of this one, and then I come up against an obstacle, and I think, I'll do that a bit later. And then I do another one, and then I come up against an obstacle, and then I think, I'll do a bit of that later. And then something pops into my email, and then I respond to that. So I never kind of fully invest my energy into any one particular task. I never commit. And you get into the state of doubt and indecision. So it's not a sort of rational doubt. It's more like just an unwillingness to invest your energy to really deeply engage with a particular activity. I hope you kind of recognize what I'm talking about. It can be really, like I say, really quite debilitating. And I do think, actually, I was thinking about doubt, and particularly when I was younger, I used to experience this an awful lot. And I think it was partly because I couldn't really see anything that I really wanted to do, that I really wanted to engage with, that everything just seemed a little bit meaningless. So I just used to sort of float from one thing to the next and never really fully engage with anything. Really quite frustrating state. So that's doubt and indecision. So what you might notice, I'll just stop that screen share now for a sec. So what you might notice is that you recognize one of those. So often I think we have a particular kind of go-to hindrance. Really what they are is they're a little bit like strategies for responding to the challenges that we encounter in our life. That, like I said a minute ago, the difficulty is that they don't really work terribly well. Just getting anxious about things doesn't really help. Just getting really angry and pissed off about things doesn't really help. You might find that you've got a particular one that you notice reoccurring, a sort of, as it were, a favorite hindrance. They're often talked about in relation to meditation, but really what you begin to notice the more you develop awareness is that they're arising at different times in one's life. They're not there all the time, obviously. Well, hopefully that's obvious. It's not that they're all, I'll get onto what happens when we're free of them in a moment, but it's important to recognize that they're not just something that happens in meditation, that these tendencies are operative at different times in our lives. And really, they're what we're trying to overcome. And the Buddhist tradition is very, in a way, kind of pragmatic. It's a bit like, you can work with these and you can actually overcome them completely. So that's, the state of awakening. The state of the Buddha is where those hindrances have been entirely overcome. They don't arise anymore. And you might have even, if you've been at this for a bit, you might have even noticed that some of them are not as operative in your life as maybe they were. So there's a few strategies for responding to these hindrances, as they're called. So one of them is cultivating the opposite. So this is where you knock, you kind of, in a way, well, that the image that the Buddha gives is of it's an image from carpentry. And I don't know if you've seen kind of old barns or old buildings, and often the timbers are held together with pegs, not with nails or bolts, but with kind of wooden pegs. And the Buddha gives the analogy that if you want to get rid of a peg, you knock it out with another peg. And he says that if you want to get rid of a coarse peg, you can knock it out with a finer peg. So it's sort of saying that if we're in a state of ill will, for example, we knock it out with metta, with goodwill. If we're in a state of anxiety, we cultivate calm and we knock it out that way. So this is cultivating the opposite. I was thinking again about ill will, and often what ill will does is it will emphasize or accentuate or exaggerate something problematic about a person. And when we do that, we forget about all the things that are good about that person or beneficial about that person. This is particularly striking with our parents. We get angry with our father or our mother, and it's like all the things that they've done for us, we completely forget about them, and we just focus in on what they've done that's harmful, or we feel is harmful. So one way of countering that is just to actually think, okay, well, that's true. They did that thing, but they've also done all these other things which have been really, really valuable, which have been really, really helpful to me. And that can really profoundly shift one's attitude towards somebody who's harmed one. That's one sort of strategy. And actually even talking about those things. We talked about rejoicing in merits a few weeks ago, but actually pointing that out and consciously and deliberately talking about things that they've done that have benefited us. Another strategy is considering the consequences. So just actually thinking, reflecting, well, in a way, this is a little bit like what I was saying about eradication, that if I keep this mental state going, it's just not going to be beneficial for anybody. It's not going to help me. It's not going to help anybody else. And so really acknowledging that can really help us just to sort of move on and to let it go. Another strategy is to recognize that, well, what the Buddha says, and I looked up the original sutta, or the original discourse of the Buddha, where he describes these methods, and he says, try to forget those thoughts and not give attention to them. So in a sense, you just recognize that this is here, this mental state is present, but you don't kind of get tangled up in it. You don't over kind of egg it, as it were. You just let it be there without investing a lot of energy into it, and just let it float away a bit like a cloud in a blue sky. So in a sense, you're trying to hold it with a sense of spaciousness, with a sense that this is just another aspect of my experience. And often when we get in a negative mental state, we kind of get all tangled up in it. But this is just actually allowing it to kind of pass. The last method is suppression, which is where you just actually forcibly push the mental state, the unskillful mental state away. It's probably not to be recommended generally, because often part of the problem is we're not able to just acknowledge the existence of these mental states, and then us pushing them away is part of the difficulty. So, but it is quite. I find it is useful if I'm just doing something which is just kind of a low level craving or a low level irritation, and just don't need to say, no, I just don't do that. It's just a bit like deciding just to cop on. And the third one, I'll just mention this, and then we'll have a break. We'll pick up the other two, developing and maintaining, after the break. But the other one is, in a way, none of these methods work. So sometimes you get in a real state, as we say, and you know that you're in a real state, but it feels like whatever you do to try and get out of the state doesn't really work. So in the Buddhist context, what you can do is you can do what's called go for refuge, which means you just, in a way, remember that you still have the potential for awakening within you. It's a little bit buried at the minute, but you kind of affirm that connection that you have with the three jewels, with the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the enlightened person, the teaching, and the community, and you just, as it were, kind of affirm that within your own being. And it may be that quite often when things become really difficult in our practice, and we really face into some of these more problematic or complex areas of our character, that we actually begin to really make progress. So I think it's really important to remember that it's not all kind of sweetness and light. That sometimes the most progress happens when you really encounter some of the sort of demons, as it were, that lie within your own mind. So I've presented quite a bit of material. I'll have less to say about developing and maintaining. But one thing I wanted to say just before we finish for the moment is, it sounds a little bit technical maybe, and it can almost sound a little bit like paint by numbers. But what we're trying to do is lay out a kind of a map, lay out the sort of territory, so that we can recognize where we are and work creatively and appropriately from where we are. That's what this is about. It's not about like, well, if you're in this one, do that, and if you're in that one, do this. It's much more complex and much more interesting, actually, much more fun than that. But it does give you this kind of material, just give you a bit of a handle on what's going on, and then you're in a much stronger position to be able to respond. And that's what perfect effort really is. Perfect, in a way, you could say it's like skillful or intelligent or appropriate effort. It's not just, like I say, just pushing things away that we don't like. Often it actually involves moving towards things we don't like. Anyway, hey, look, we'll have a break. We'll have a break for 10 minutes. So I make it, let's see what the time is, 8 minutes past. So we'll come back at 18 minutes past and we'll pick this up, and I'll say a little bit about developing and maintaining, and then we'll do some meditation. Okay, so it's time to kick off. So a couple of interesting questions. Here we go. Where are we? So I have one here. Regarding hindrances, I struggle with an illness that compels me to scratch my body, which isn't good for me. I can sometimes resist, though often with great difficulty. Can this compulsion be regarded as a mental state? And if so, what hindrance is it, and what strategies might I use to overcome it? So I think one of the things you start noticing, the more you become aware of what's going on, is how interrelated we are, our body and our mind is. We often talk about them like they're two completely discrete systems or experiences, but really the more we begin to look at them, we see that they're interrelated. So for example, often if there's something going on with our body, it will stimulate a response, a mental response. So I've actually had the experience myself. I got terribly savaged by bed bugs on a B&B one time, and I was horribly itchy, and it really affected my whole being, actually. This horrible feeling of agitation. So I can relate to what you were describing. So in a sense, it was a kind of an anxiety, and I could, if I was sufficiently aware, resist the urge to scratch myself. Very difficult to do. So I think you can overcome. I would say, in answer to your question, I think it is a species of restlessness and anxiety, and one can overcome it. I think it's very difficult as that is. One would have to be, again, guarding the gates to the senses. I mean, the skin is a sense; it's a sense of touch. So one would be constantly on one's guard to not let that painful experience from the skin provoke a response of scratching. In a way, scratching or being itchy is a really good metaphor for how our lives are, what our lives are often like. Often there's things that are itchy, and what we need to do is kind of leave them alone, but we often scratch them, and that exacerbates the problem. So I think in a way, yeah, having an itch, even a chronic itch, is a good metaphor for some of the things that we deal with in our life. I say that understanding that it's very difficult. But in a way, again, just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, probably worth the effort. So chuck in another question if you've got any response to that. To what degree is it possible to be in multiple hindrances at once? How does one prioritize which strategy to use in this case? I think it can be. For example, if you're really, really angry with somebody, often, and you're unable to express it, often that can provoke a sense of anxiety, for example, or it can provoke a kind of shutting down, a kind of sloth and torpor, a kind of stagnation response where you just can't quite face just the depth of your hurt, even. So they can be quite complex. So how does one prioritize which strategy to use in this case? I mean, maybe it's just a matter of actually just doing something that actually works, So you kind of work on the area that you can work on, if you see what I mean. Because what we're dealing with, we're dealing with some quite deep impulses and some quite deep habits. So I think it's a matter of you're working away, kind of, even you could think of it in terms of like picking the low-hanging fruit, and then just working away at something and untangling the whole knot. I often think about this process of working with unskillful mental states as like untangling a ball of yarn that's got all tangled up, and you're just slowly and patiently pulling the different threads. And often it's quite a painstaking business to do that. I don't know if you've ever done that. I find it intensely satisfying to get a big knotted ball of string and just to sort of slowly unpick it. It's yeah. So anyways, that's what I would say in response to that question. This is an interesting question. Modern psychology suggests exploring, understanding, and reconciling with early life trauma that contributes towards arising unskillful states. Is the Buddhist advice in conflict with this? I would say, in a way, yes and no. I think I'm not. What I'm describing here is not a process, a kind of a course process where you just kind of push things away, which are complex. Because often, we get into particular states of mind because of particular experiences that we've had in our lives. And often what we need to do is just move towards those experiences with a sense of openness and kindness. At the same time, recognizing that often what happens is that the way that we've learned to respond to difficulty in our life is not very helpful. It doesn't help us move forward. So it may be that the reason that we get really, really upset and really angry about certain things is because of painful experiences in our past. I mean, I certainly do this. So in a sense, it's important to acknowledge where they've come from. At the same time, recognize that just keeping on in the same pattern of responding to that difficulty with aversion doesn't work, if you see what I mean. So you're making a kind of a stand to say, I acknowledge where this is coming from. I recognize that where it's coming from. At the same time, I don't want to continue forward from here in my life repeating the same patterns. I want to find a way of responding creatively to these situations rather than just responding or reacting in the way that I've reacted before. So do you sort of see what I mean? That was a question from Colin. I think it's quite an important distinction. I think what can happen, and what I've noticed happening sometimes when we become a little bit more aware of our conditioning, let's say our sort of psychological conditioning, and if we're not careful, what can happen is we get kind of stuck. We because we recognize, it can be like a moment of insight. I see now why I'm like this. And then we never make, but we don't make the next step, which is to move forward from there. We just kind of get stuck in the past. And I'm not saying all psychology is like this, but sometimes I've noticed that people talk in a psychological way, which is unhelpful. And the way that they're talking actually exacerbates the problem. It doesn't help them move forward. So hopefully that's clear what I'm saying. So I'm saying that it can be really helpful to recognize why we behave the way that we do. At the same time, what I'm saying really is we need to take responsibility for the fact that if we want to move forward in our life, we're going to have to move beyond that. That doesn't mean rejecting where we've come from or hating where we've come from, but it means recognizing that we can build our lives from now in a more creative way and build something for the future, and in a way unpick or untangle those more complex and problematic responses. So hopefully that answers your question. Observation. Hatred can often arise from fear, and I find that when I'm too indecisive, I'm too much on though and not enough in the heart. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think probably hatred always arises from fear. Like there's something painful that we're trying to avoid, and we just immediately push it away, and we lose a sense of connectedness. I mean, that's what metta is that sense of fellow feeling or solidarity. So we just hate, and that is immediately cancelled out when we do that. Also, creative. Yeah, also I find that when I'm too indecisive, I'm too much in the thought mind and not enough in the heart. Yeah. So a lot of these hindrances arise from kind of alienation. we don't quite know what's going on. We're not quite aware of what's happening. We're kind of split. Um, so that is, in a way, a characteristic of all of these hindrances, is that there's a kind of a splintering or a fragmentation of consciousness. There isn't, our energy isn't available. It's all going in lots of different directions. So what we're trying to do, gosh, there's lots of responses. What we're trying to do is draw our mind together, which starts blending into the developing effort, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I just want to address this another question. Can you give any suggestions of how to help with doubt and indecision? Yeah, I mean, generally, the kind of longer term answer to that is clarity. But often when you're in a state of doubt and indecision, you don't have any clarity. So you can't just magically conjure up clarity. But what you can do is just commit. So it's just actually saying, okay, I don't know if this is the best thing for me to be doing right now, but I'll just do it. This is what I find. Sometimes I just have to say, okay, I'm not sure. There's a million things I should be doing right now. I'm not sure which one of them is more important, but I'm just going to do this thing and get it done. And then you feel like you've accomplished something. So just actually committing to a particular course of action, I think, is what we need to do with doubt and indecision. That's what I'd say. I hope those answers are adequate. I mean, it's so difficult because you don't get any feedback from people about. And if this was a normal class, we kind of get into dialogue much more easily, but it's a bit more difficult when there's 55 people and we're looking at each other through television screens. So if I've said something which wasn't very subtle, I apologize. I better get on with this because I just want to finish off. So yeah, so that all came out of eradicating arisen, unskillful mental states. Yeah, so it's a lot of work to do there. So the next one is about developing skillful mental states, unarisen skillful mental states. So in a sense, this is looking at the same process from a different point of view. So I mentioned earlier cultivating the opposite. So in a sense, this is what this is. So you're trying to develop this state of absorption. So I mentioned a minute ago that hindrances are characterized by a scattering or a dissipation of our energy. What happens when we skillful mental states are coherent. They draw our energy together. They're harmonious. Our energy is available. It's like a stream that's all moving in the same direction. So this word jhana is used to describe what that's like. Yeah. So jhana is a state of absorption where we're stable in our attention on a particular activity or object. And it's characterized by enjoyment. We enjoy ourselves. We might even feel bliss. There's a clarity of thought, and our mind doesn't hop around. It's able to stay with something, to pick up something and kind of investigate it. Now, if we get into deeper states of absorption, and this is really what we're talking here in terms of meditation, thought can completely cease. So we're just deeply absorbed in what we're doing without any mental activity, without any thinking activity, that is. So the Buddha gives a series of similes for what this is like. And the simile for jhana is interesting. He talks about it as kneading soap powder with water. So in India, they used to use a particular kind of ground nut, and you can make soap out of it. But you needed to saturate it with water. So you've got something dry and you've got something wet, and you knead it together so that the moisture is completely absorbed into the powder. So that there's no moisture left over, but there's no dry powder left over either. So you end up with a dry thing and a wet thing, and you join them together into this ball of soap. The strong suggestion is of two things coming together and becoming whole, becoming integrated, becoming unified. Yeah, so that's That's what meditative absorption is like. Some of you will have experienced this in meditation, I'm sure. Some of you won't have, and that's okay as well. But you probably will have experienced this at some time in your life, maybe through listening to music, or just a moment where you're deeply engrossed in a conversation with a friend, and maybe even dancing. You know, some people get really absorbed in dancing, but we really enjoy it. This experience of absorption. So that's what we're trying to do when we develop. We're trying to develop skillful mental states that kind of cohere, that come together. So this is in a way looking at it from. It's almost like looking at eradicating from the positive point of view. And I think it's really important that we do both. We try and cultivate the positive as well as get rid of the negative, as it were. And that's what we're concerned with here. However, we have to recognize that if we're in a negative mental state, we need to work with that. We can't just wish it away. So that's a brief kind of overview of developing unarisen skillful mental states. And then the fourth one is maintaining arisen skillful mental states. So what this is about is, if we're in a positive mental state, is maintaining the conditions that gave rise to that, the supportive conditions that gave rise to that. So that could be a myriad of things. But I do notice a lot of the times that people come along to the Buddhist Center, they do a course like this one or an in-person one, and then they just get out of the habit. And the meditation and the skillful mental states that they've developed just begin to kind of slowly dissipate. And so it's really important to recognize that skillful mental states require conditions, particular conditions. And often what we need to do to maintain skillful mental states is maintain the conditions that give rise to them. In a way, practicing the Eightfold Path will do that. All the different aspects: communication, skillful action, and so on. So that's basically the fourfold perfect effort: preventing unskillful mental states, which is guarding the gates to the senses primarily; eradicating arisen unskillful mental states, which is practicing the five hindrances, working with the five hindrances; developing unarisen skillful mental states, which means coursing in jhana as much as possible, and then maintaining arisen skillful mental states, creating the conditions or maintaining the conditions that give rise to those skillful mental states. So all of this presupposes something, and what it presupposes is a self-awareness. You kind of have to know where you are in order to be able to work with this material usefully and effectively. So what's really important, I think, is just developing a kind of benign curiosity in what's going on, what our mind is, just sort of being really fascinated by it, really curious about it, and not worrying about it. Like if we're in a negative mental state, and not sort of worrying about that. Like I said a minute ago, it's quite natural, but we just have to recognize it's not terribly helpful. Often we can be quite heavy with ourselves. But I think to begin with, what we need to do, most of us, is just actually get curious, and just open up to what's there. So I just wanted to do some meditation now, and what we're going to do is just be curious about what our mind is up to, what's going on in our experience. So if you just want to get into some kind of a meditation posture, we'll do a wee bit of meditation. So we're not going to do anything really difficult. We're just going to relax into what's going on. Just getting a sense of our state of mind, our state of being. So firstly, getting a sense of the space around you. So the walls of the room, the other objects in the room, there may be other people in the room. And noticing the way that our experience of ourself happens in that space. It happens somewhere. And our body fills space. It has different parts and different sensations that occupy different parts of space. There's our legs and our buttocks in contact with what we're sitting on, our chest, our belly, our arms and our head and neck. Our hands, and just noticing how the body feels. So, for example, is there an agitation, a restlessness in the body? Or is the body quite peaceful and tranquil and calm? Is there a dullness in the body, a sense of energy that's stagnant or rigid? Or does the body feel light and bright and alive? And is there a sense of contentment? In other words, are we happy to be where we are? Or is there a hankering for some other kind of experience? A craving for some kind of experience? And if there is, well, there is. Noticing how that feels to hanker. Is there a kind of warmth, a kindly attitude? Or is there a hardness or an aversion to something or someone? A preoccupation with a painful event in the past? Is there anxiety and worry? Or does the mind feel peaceful? Is there a sense of engagement and commitment to developing awareness? Or is there an unwillingness to commit, a vagueness, a doubt, an indecisiveness? Remembering that the purpose is to just know what's going on, not to judge or condemn, but to understand. So in order to deepen our quality of mind through attending to our breathing, how might we go about doing that? What do we need to do to deepen our attention, to deepen our engagement, to deepen our enjoyment of being aware of our breathing? We might just need to relax. That's all. We might need to attend to the breath low down in our body. If we're dull, we might need to open our eyes. If there's hankering, craving, we might need to look for enjoyment in what we're presently doing. So with appropriate effort, beginning to attend to what our body does as we breathe. What's happening? How does it feel? How does our body move? And if we wish, we could place a count at the end of the out-breath. And then letting go of trying to focus your attention and just sit. So in terms of guarding the gates to the senses, thinking of one way that you could practice that, one way that you could just be a bit more mindful of what you allow into your senses. So that you're not going to precipitate yourself into a negative mental state. So under the heading of eradicating, do you have a sense of what your particular favourite hindrance might be? Don't worry if you don't. And how might you work with that? By cultivating the opposite or one of the other methods? So I'll just mention the home practice for this week, and then I'll make one comment, and then we'll finish. So just think of one way this week you can guard the gates to the senses, which might mean just turning some notifications off from your emails, or maybe just actually not. Just not having things lying around in your kitchen that you might look at that won't really help you. For example, like magazines or I don't know, old newspapers or something. See if you can just figure out what your favorite hindrance might be, and actually have a sense of how you might work with that, both in meditation and outside meditation. The third thing, if this is too much, just do something. I'm giving you 4 things because there's 4 perfect efforts. So I just wanted to kind of keep the symmetry. Notice when you're absorbed this week. It may not be when you expect, but just notice when you're get really deeply engaged in what it is that you're doing. And the 4th thing is how you're going to maintain your momentum after this course is finished. So we're kind of coming towards the end of this course. This is the 6th of 8 weeks. We've only got, 2 more weeks to go, really. So yeah, how can you maintain the momentum that you've developed? That's another question. And there's just a little comment in the chat there. I'll email you that tomorrow. At least Kevin will. Colin says, but impermanence will take care of all states, right? Now, I know you're just being tongue-in-cheek, but all that impermanence means is that our mental states will change. They won't necessarily improve. So I think this is really important, that without effort, there won't be any development. So I think it's really, really important. We need to actually creatively engage with what's going on in our lives in order for there to be development, in order for there to be transformation. I think sometimes we just wait around for things to change kind of passively only, but there needs to be an active dimension, a creative dimension. I know you're just joking, but I just didn't want to make that point, because sometimes I think we can unconsciously kind of assume that, oh, well, impermanence will take care of it, but it won't necessarily. Anyway, I just wanted to leave you with that. So we'll leave it there for tonight. Yeah, we'll next week we'll be talking about awareness, developing awareness in particular. So that's it.